So giraffe live in these scattered populations throughout Africa, not in the middle of the rainforest here in the middle. And they probably did inhabit most of sub-Saharan Africa at one point, but now they're in these different groups. The population that I am going to talk the most about, there's Zambia, and those are the Thornycroft's giraffe. So Zambia is here in the middle of Africa, and Thornycroft's giraffe live only in the Luangwa Valley. So most of the slides and the talks will be based upon the Thornycroft's giraffe that I observed here. This is the location that I worked at. And although acknowledgements are usually at the end of the talk, I do have to thank 3 people who helped me with the studies in Zambia. First and foremost is my colleague, friend, and true natural history person, which is Philip Berry. He grew up back when the country was called Northern Rhodesia, lived there his whole life, and has been watching giraffes since at least 1973, which is when our systematic data collection began. The second person is Andy Hogg, who is in charge of the Bush Camp Company, and he graciously allowed me to stay there whenever I was working with Phil on the giraffes. And the third person is Ian Salisbury, who actually works for Andy, but in his spare time, he's a fantastic wildlife photographer, and he's given me permission to use some of his pictures during this talk. And you'll easily be able to distinguish his more professional looking photos from my talks. Okay, so let's start with giraffe life history. So birth to death, what happens with giraffe? They give birth all year long. It's an annual pattern. Although it looks like there are some clusters and peaks of births, this is the dry season. It turns out that this distribution, which is based upon the 30 to 40 years of data that we collected on the Thornycroft's giraffe, is a random distribution. It does not differ from chance. If it's split into the wet and the dry seasons, there's still no difference between the seasons. So essentially, giraffes can have babies any time of the year. Now, this pattern, and I'll bring up baboons, is similar to baboons. They appear every once in a while in this talk because there are some similarities with their reproductive patterns, and because that was the first species I studied, as well as Craig Packer, by the way. But in a number of populations, they reported pulses. So sometimes during the wet season, there are more births than during the dry season. And I'll get to why that might be the case later, but as an example, in Etosha National Park over in Namibia, Emma Hart reported that there were pulses, so that there were more births in the wet season than in the dry season. They give birth about every 20 months, close to every 2 years. In the wild, it's about every 607 days. These male and females are from the study that I did at the San Diego Zoo Wild Animal Park. It's now called the San Diego Safaripark, with Meredith Bayshaw over a couple of years. And what we found was that the interbirth interval doesn't differ, whether it's a male or a female offspring that survives. And this interval is not different than the interval here. So essentially, the interbirth interval in captivity and in the wild are about the same, which isn't a surprise because most of the 607 days are taken up by gestation, which is about 15 months, and that doesn't vary that much. The birth ratio is about 1:1. It's not significantly different from 1:1. So half the calves born are male, half the calves born are female. In the wild, an average of half the calves die before they're a year old. Now, again, this can vary from 1/3 to 3/4, but overall, at all the study sites, half of giraffe calves die. Now, that's a key one to keep in mind when I get to the end point about conservation issues and giraffe reproduction when half of the calves are dying. The main cause of calf death is actually lion. lions kill and eat a large number of calves. Now, in a fascinating study that was done by Megan Strauss, who was studying the giraffe the same time Craig was studying the lions in the same place, she discovered that adults sometimes escape lion attacks, and you can figure out more or less how often the lions are attacking males and females because the lions leave their claw marks on the giraffe hides. So if you're on a safari in Africa, and if you get close enough to a giraffe and you look, usually it's at the rear on their haunches, and you see these marks that are parallel, chances are that giraffe has escaped from a lion. Young calves are not that adept at escaping from lion prides. Lion prides can bring down a fully adult bull weighing 1,500 kilos. So bringing down a 150 kilo calf is not that big of a challenge. Giraffes tend to give their births in different places within an area. So these particular markers represent different females. So the blue triangle is one female. This was one calf, another calf, another calf, another calf. You can see she spread out where she gave her calves. Black star is another female. And during the course of our study, she had 3 calves. 2 were born here, 1 were born there. That's Mafui Lodge. So they really don't concentrate their births in a specific area. They probably give births depending upon the microhabitat at the time, because the ecosystem does change depending upon the seasons and other species. However, what giraffes are capable of doing is they sometimes change the birth location from one calf to the next based on calf survivorship. So if a female has a surviving calf, the next one is more likely to be born closer in space to the previous one than if the calf doesn't survive. Or see if I can go backward. Nope, backward. There we go. Okay, so in other words, if this calf was born and this one followed it, then that would represent a survivorship of this one, and this one would follow close in time, as opposed to this one and this one from the same mother. Moose do the same to avoid grizzly bears. And one of the things that I mentioned was they try to give birth in microhabitats, and I give you a little bit of time, not much because I already used up too much time trying to figure out how to do this, to find the calf in the picture. So here's the mother, and here's the calf. They do hide their young. So after they're born, assuming they survive, they grow really quickly. So a newborn calf is actually taller than I am. And then within a year, it's almost doubled its height. Now, they don't suckle that much. They only suckle for about a minute. And they don't suckle that often, but the milk is really a potent source for growth. Then they can sometimes get weaned when they're 3-4 months. Sometimes they're still feeding when they're a year old. But by the time they're a year old, they're tall enough that it becomes difficult to suckle because they have to bend the neck all the way over there to their nipples. Males and females are born in the same ratio. So the calves are male, half the calves are males, half the calves are females, and they begin growth on the same trajectory. So there's no difference in birth weight. But then, as you can see by these patterns here, it takes longer for males to grow to maturity. They become fully mature when they're around 9 or 10 years old. Females begin to taper off in growth and become mature when they're around 5, 6 years of age. They have their first offspring at about 6.5, 7 years of age. So in order to understand the life history of giraffes, during the infant and juvenile stage, males and females are following similar growth trajectories and behaving quite similar, but there's a major difference once they hit sexual maturity and puberty in terms of how males and females follow different life history patterns. The giraffes are like quite a few ungulates in that they perform this flamen activity where the males try to figure out what's the reproductive state of females. So here's a male in the wild prodding the female, female urinates, male then lifts his head up, probably gets some scent chemicals, and then tries to figure out what to do, whether or not to hang around, mate with a female, go someplace else or whatever. And male giraffes follow a reproductive strategy during their life history, which is called roaming, as similar to elephants. So here's how roaming works. Here's a group of females, there's a few herds of females there, and then those are the males. So we'll follow this guy. This guy comes over here, herd of 3 females. He prods them, tries to figure out, are any of them receptive? Nope. So he goes to another group. In this group now, it does the same thing. Says, oh, any of them receptive? Not sure. So he figures, nope, go try to another group. This is how males spend their life. They go from group to group. Goes from here. Now, this one already has 1 male. He joins the other males, and now there's 2 males in this group. Checks out the female, says, nope. Then he goes over to this group of 2, checks them out, and there you go. Then finds another group. There's already 2 males and 3 females, and that's where he ends up because one of these is sexually receptive. So the roaming male reproductive strategy involves wandering around Africa, trying to find sexually receptive females. An underrated aspect of giraffe physiology is male metabolism and energetics, because a lot of attention is paid to the energetic costs of females being pregnant and lactating. A lot less attention is paid to the fact that the male is wandering all over the place, has to eat while he's walking, moves all over searching for females. Females, on the other hand, tend to remain close to where they were born, so they generally have smaller home ranges than males. And instead of wandering around looking for males, they focus their energy on raising the calves. Now, so here's a particular example of one of the females that we did follow. She lived to be 25, and she produced 11 offspring. Of the 11, 2 never produced offspring, despite the fact that they reach adulthood. And she lived long enough to see 3 grand offspring born. So females spend their life history in a relatively smaller area than males, and they wait for males to come by to mate with them. They don't go searching for males. Males seem to find them somehow. Males, on the other hand, wander around looking for females, and once they find the females, then they have to figure out which ones are sexually receptive. Among females, it's fairly straightforward if you collect long-term data to see what factors are influencing how many offspring they have. And the answer in giraffe, which is the same as the answer in a lot of mammals, including baboons, is the longer they live, here's the longevity of specific females, the more likely they are to have more offspring. In some cases, there are scientists who have suggested that they have a better chance of producing more offspring if they start breeding at a younger age. But in giraffe, no matter what age you have your first birth, it doesn't relate to the total number of births. In other words, age at first birth is not a predictor of future births. However, by the time you die, that is a good indicator of how many offspring you've had. So here's the summary slide of giraffe life history, which is actually more simple than it looks. So I'll just highlight the key things to note here is males and females are similar up until they start going through puberty. Males then change from a brownish to a blackish color. They have to find and mate with females. They have a shorter lifespan than females. In general, the average male in this population dies when he's 16, but the oldest one that we know of lived to about 21 years old. Females, on the other hand, on average die when they're 17, but they can live to about 28. Half the cows die on average. Average female lives till she's 16. So on average, again, this is a crucial aspect of giraffe life history to bear in mind when we get to the conservation part, is on average, a female is going to produce somewhere between 3 and 5 offspring. Half are going to die. Sex ratio at birth is 1 to 1. So on average, a female giraffe produces 1 female surviving calf. They have a maximum of about a 20-year breeding lifespan, but on average, if the first birth is 7 and they die at 17, they can produce calves for about 10 years. And the interbirth interval close to 2 years, that's 5 calves. Males, on the other hand, we don't know. For the students out there, I would say, at this point, a worthwhile topic to follow, although it's really difficult because nobody succeeded in doing it yet, is to figure out paternity among giraffe. We have no clue whatsoever what the differences are in the reproductive success of giraffes in the wild. Attempting to establish the reproductive success based upon analysis of DNA contained in feces has been minimally successful. So it's an open area of inquiry. We do know that among females in this population, some haven't produced any offspring, some haven't produced 11. We know that among males, their reproductive lifespan is about half that of females. In other words, they're mature at 10, they die at 16 on average. They've got to breed if they're going to have their genes passed on over a period of 6 years. So the life history is folded into their social behavior. So a logical question to ask would be, how are giraffes social? What is social behavior among giraffe? So here's social behavior among giraffe. They actually greet each other. They do nuzzle up against each other. They make contact with each other. Here we have a calf and an adult male. They're nuzzling each other. So they are social animals. When people watch documentaries about baboons or primates or other charismatic mammals, the documentary filmmakers usually throw away like 90% of their footage because most of the time the animals are not social. Baboons spend probably 2/3 to 3/4 of the day walking around feeding, but you wouldn't know that if you watch a documentary on baboon behavior. They aren't that social in terms of their activity budget. So giraffe are not as social as baboons, but they do end up interacting with each other. And their social behavior extends to how they interact with each other in a larger context. They form babysitting groups. They're called nurseries or creches. And in general, most of these only have about 2 or 3 calves, but these groups have been formed up to 9. Now, in a babysitting group, the females alternate who's actually on guard and who's wandering off to feed. They take turns. It's a rotating system. Another study that people can do is a follow-up to a study that Miho Sato did on babysitting groups, is trying to figure out how these giraffe actually allocate their time. How do they make decisions as to whose turn it is? They certainly don't draw straws and then figure out, okay, the short straw is the loser and you got to stay here and watch all the kids while we go off and have fun. One suggestive aspect of these babysitting groups in terms of why they're advantageous comes from a study that Miho Sato did, and again, the sample size is small. But what she found was that 80% of the calves that were born into a nursery group actually survived to 1 year. There wasn't a control group, as the one in Zambia, where we found that about half the calves died. But I'll come back to the babysitting groups later. It's possible that their social behavior in terms of forming these protective associations does help the calves survive. Another aspect of sociality is they are vigilant. So they do look around. Now, the vigilance that they do, here's the giraffe looking around, here's the giraffe looking around. Well, this one is drinking and this one is drinking. The vigilance behavior is context dependent. And so depending on where they are, while they're drinking or eating, they will scan the environment. I've never seen a herd of giraffe all drink at once. Now, that could be because of my limited observations. It could be because giraffe don't drink every day. But every time I've seen giraffe drinking, there's usually one watching out. A hint and a suggestion for a student project is go to a water hole, watch the giraffes, see if they ever all drink at the same time, or if they are vigilant, at least one of them in the group, compared to the others. And if you can watch them long enough and identify them, then you might be able to figure out the relationships among the giraffe. So they do have this extensive social behavior where they greet each other, where they form babysitting groups, where they are vigilant when they are with other giraffes. And this is the basis for them forming the herds. Most herds are fairly small. Most herds are less than a half a dozen. Some can be over 30. And some herds outside of Zambia have been reported as twice this number. But one of the more consistent things in giraffe research, which has come up from every single study site that's ever looked at it, is that the variation in size could be substantial. Almost all herds average about 5, 6, or 7 animals. The average is somewhere in here for whatever reason. Now, the size of herds does change depending upon the season. So during the wet season, it tends to be larger than during the dry season. Herds are mostly a bunch of females. As I mentioned, the males have this roaming reproductive strategy. So males are seen alone most of the time. Females are seen with groups most of the time. So there are some sex differences in herd formation. To study giraffes over a long period of time, you want a way to identify them, and they've conveniently developed this spotting pattern, which is different across all individuals. And so this giraffe and this giraffe are identifiable by specific spot patterns. Now, studying giraffes is easy because of this, but this is true for all animals. Once you start studying, they can tell the differences. It doesn't take long to pick up on these specific nuances of the spot patterns in giraffe, as opposed to something like baboons. But when I first went to the field to study baboons, first day I was out with the troop, they all looked like a bunch of clones to me. I couldn't understand how the heck you could tell baboons apart. Within a few months, they all looked so different that I couldn't understand how the hell I ever thought that they all looked the same. And they're so distinguishable that after a while, I was able to identify a baboon at least 1 kilometer off when the sun's going down behind it, and you only see its silhouette based on how it walked. So if humans can pick this up, again, put on your giraffe thinking cap, use your giraffe thinking cap, put that bonnet on. If you're a giraffe, you may be able to perceive these differences in the spots. And there are 3 reasons which have been suggested for why the giraffes actually evolved this spotting system. Briefly, one is for thermoregulation, that the black absorbs the heat, the white dissipates the heat, and so they're actually adapted to these hot arid environments with the spotted pattern. One of the major difficulties with that idea is that giraffe also coexist with zebra that have black and white stripes, not spots, with lions that are tawny colored, not spotted at all, with baboons that are brindle colored, with elephants that are gray colored, and mammals all thermoregulate. So whether the spots were designed for thermoregulation or simply function in thermoregulation is something that people can consider, but based on, there's a book written in 1966, which I'd actually recommend students to read, even though it's considered old-fashioned, by George Williams, called Adaptation and Natural Selection. And one of the key points he makes is to really distinguish whether something has evolved, try to figure out what it's designed for and what it's a byproduct of. So I'm not too keen on the thermoregulation idea. Second idea is camouflage, that they're very well hidden. Most animals that do use camouflage as an anti-predator mechanism also freeze when confronted with a predator. Giraffe calves, as Ann Dagg has pointed out, are pretty curious creatures. They're not known to lie still when human observers come up, and they probably don't when a lion is kind of stalking them. Furthermore, if half of giraffe calves are dying mostly due to lion kills, chances are that they're not very well camouflaged against the lions. The third idea, which by now you figured is the one that I like, is that the spots evolved for social communication, that the giraffe actually can identify individuals because individual recognition is important within this system. And that idea is not unique to giraffe. In colonies of penguins, where you've got hundreds of animals, the mothers and the chicks recognize each other's calls. The calls are acoustically distinguishable among individuals. So one of the underrated things in animal behavior, which again, students should focus on more, is the extent to which animals are not just a bunch of organisms wandering around, but they really do interact with each other as individuals, whether they're giraffes or lions. Once one can distinguish the giraffes and know who's who, then one can get a better idea of the social systems that they live in. And they have a dynamic system, which is called fission fusion, which I'll run through here. So all giraffes I mentioned have an individual identity. So these giraffes all have different colors. And I'll briefly run through what is a fission fusion system and how does it work in giraffes. And I'll pay particular attention to the yellow one here, black one here, and these pink and blue ones. So here's how fission fusion works. You go out on day one and you see these three herds of giraffes. One or five, one's three, one's two. Go out day two, and this is what it looks like. You still see three herds of giraffe, but they've got different animals. Day three, they look like this. Three herds of giraffe, but different animals. Day four, they look like this. Yellow guy's all alone over here. This guy's all alone here. You got a herd of four, a herd of three. This guy's all alone. So you have three loners and then two other herds. Go out the next day, it looks like this. Again, there's three herds, but there's a different in composition. And then you go out the next day and it looks like this. Now, the reason for mentioning, and I'll go back and do this again real quickly, the pink and the blue versus the yellow is yellow never meets up with black, even though they're in the same population. Pink and blue are together almost every day. Here we go again. Pink and blue, black, yellow, pink, blue, black, yellow, pink, blue, black, yellow, pink, blue, black, yellow. So what scientists have done, and this is not just giraffe, but for others, is there's black, yellow, pink and blue are back together again. They've developed a way to actually measure how often giraffe associate with each other. No quiz on the extent of, no quiz on the math here. But basically the idea is that there are different ways to measure how often giraffe A associates with giraffe B. And they pretty much are, when you go to the field, comparing when A and B are together compared to when you see A and you see B and they're not together. So this is a measure of a social association, which is one component of a social network analysis. Now, what has been found is that the measure of social association, which can be from 0 to 1, is not directly correlated with the extent of home range overlap. So if the home ranges of 2 animals overlaps by 50% and 2 others overlap by 25%, it doesn't mean that the ones that overlap by 50% have a social association index twice as high as the ones with the 25% overlap. Now, logically, if 2 giraffes do not have overlapping home ranges, they cannot form a social association. So it is important when you read the literature and when you try to figure out what's going on with these giraffe fission fusion groups, has the scientist taken out those giraffes who can't form associations because they don't have overlapping home ranges from those who could? In the example I showed you earlier, black and yellow are in the same population. Their social association index was 0, but it's a legitimate 0 because they could have associated. So what have we found out using these measures? Well, males don't hang around too much together. Herds do have a lot of females. Males and females come together more often than males and males do. And part of that is probably due to sex. Now, what is interesting or quite intriguing about these social association indexes and the social network analysis, which, as an aside, is the way Facebook decides who you want to be friends with. Their analysis is way more sophisticated than what we did on Giraffe, but they use social network analysis based upon who your friends are to figure out who you might want your friends to be and which groups you might want to belong to. So when you get these notices from Facebook saying, hey, maybe this person that you've never met before in your entire life should be your friend, it's because they've conducted a social network analysis on your friends, on their friends, and said, hey, I think there's some overlap here, so you two should meet each other. One of the measures of social association that you can come up with the social network analysis is called social connectedness. And the reason for bringing that up is the connectedness measure combines a social association index, that is how tightly connected 2 giraffes are, with how many other giraffes they associate with. And there have been 2 studies, and they've both found the same thing, which is the social connectedness of males is greater than that of females. So Kim Vander Waal studying the reticulated giraffe in Kenya, and Derek Lee and Monica Bond studying the Maasai giraffe in Tanzania found that this male connectedness was greater than the female connectedness. So going back to their life history strategy and how the males engage in this roaming reproductive style, it makes sense because the males are wandering around and they interact with more others than females who are within the compact area, but they don't have tight bonds with them. To put it another way, the males have a lot of low quality friendships. They're more interested in quantity. They run around connecting with a lot of folks, whereas females are more interested in quality, so they spend a lot of time with fewer individuals. Kinship, when you followed them long enough, and we studied these guys for like over 30 years, you get a good idea of who's related to who, and it turns out that mothers and their adult daughters will be found in a herd about 50% more often than females who are not kin. Herds also depend upon whether animals grow up near each other or not. And this is where I mentioned Miho's work might come into play, because it hasn't been studied long term. So you have to put what we found in peer groups, which were born close to each other, but not in the same creche. They do form herds when they're adults, as compared to those that are born further apart. So from a life history perspective, and from the social dynamic perspective, what we do know is that herds are not random, that herds are made up primarily of female friends and relatives. Another component to herds is leadership. When you come across a herd of giraffe, they're oftentimes just kind of meandering around, but when they move from place to place, the one at the front is more often than not the matriarch. So as I mentioned before, on average, they die when they're 16. So all of these females have lived longer than expected. And the ones that are 20 years old are more likely to be found at the front. They're leading the way. So why might this be the case? Odds are they know more about the environment than the ones that are half their age. So if you're hanging around and you're a giraffe, again, think like giraffes, you're hanging around and you're a giraffe, who are you going to follow around the environment to keep you safe and to find food? It's more likely to be an older female who's familiar with the area. And then finally, in terms of their social behavior, I wanted to mention that they do react to death of a calf. This is a female, and placenta is here. It's enlarged here. She just gave birth to a calf, and the calf died. Now, this female spent a few hours sniffing, standing vigilant, and hanging around the calf. If that behavior was observed in primates or elephants, the immediate response from the observer is they must be showing grief, or they must be mourning the death of an individual. If that's the case for those species, then it probably applies to giraffe. Furthermore, this situation was not an anomaly. This was one that I saw when in Zambia among the thorn-crossed giraffe. However, Megan Strauss, the one who I mentioned did the claw marks, also found similar behavior in the giraffes that were living in Tanzania. And Zoe Mueller, who was studying Rothschild's giraffe in Kenya, also saw similar behavior. So it's occurred among 3 different populations of giraffe where they do pay attention to dead conspecifics. So they probably do have an association with those conspecifics. What do giraffes eat? They eat a ton of stuff. What we found was that although they eat at least 94 species, 10 of them are over half the diet. Of the 10, 4, Capparis tomentosa, Kigelia africanus, Flugia virosa, and the Tamarindus indica. My Latin sucks. But anyway, over a period of over 40 years, those 4 species contributed 38% of the diet to giraffe. So to simplify it, because I like simplifying things and use round numbers, figure they ate 100 species. 4 of the 100 species were close to 40% of the diet, which is 10 times what you'd expect. So the giraffe do selectively figure out what do they want to eat and what don't they want to eat. Now, the 2 that are most popular, these 2, in this population are the sausage tree, here, and the woolly caperbush, which is this one. Now, the sausage tree, I'll come to again, is called that for obvious reasons. These are the sausages which don't look that big when they're next to a giraffe, but these sausages can weigh, or the one I found, was 13 kilos. This is chapstick or lip balm, you might call it, to show you the size of these sausages. And so if you are on safari and your safari guide has a canvas top truck and he parks under a sausage tree, you might want to have him inch forward a bit because you don't want one of these things to fall on your head. So what about the influence of season on giraffe feeding? I mentioned there's a wet and a dry season. So this is the information from Zambia. Again, wet season is here, dry season is here, tons of rainfall during the wet season. And back to the idea of the reproductive flexibility of the females and when they're having their births, the gestation part, as I mentioned, doesn't vary too much. Season does influence their feeding because of food availability, but can also influence whether they're having birth pulses. And one of the main questions that people have asked for a while is whether the birth pulses are a result of conception peaks resulting because the food availability increases the odds of female cycling, or is it because food availability increases the odds of infant survivorship? You can see here that the diet does change according to season among the giraffes. So in the wet season, they specialize on these two species. In the dry season, they specialize on these two species. There is a shift in diet by season. Now, what we found in the giraffes in Zambia was that during the wet season, they were eating more species than during the dry season. And that probably had to do with the fact that there were a lot of species during the wet season that were providing great nourishment, and they were in a clumped area. On the other hand, in the Namib Desert, Julian Fennessy found the opposite. He said that he found that they're eating more species in the dry season, probably for the same reason, that in order to get the right amount of nutrition, they actually had to wander far and wide and choose lots of different species. So one of the key things to keep in mind about giraffe is that there is consistency in some things, like herd size tends to be between 4 and 6, but there's diversity in others, like whether there are pulses in births, whether it's random, and whether they eat more species or less species depending upon season. So what about sex? Does sex influence their diet? Males are bigger than females, or they could be 50% larger than females, so they have the ability to reach higher up in the trees. And we didn't find a significant difference in the percent of the diet that the animals were eating. The Shannon-Weiner H prime is an index of how diverse the diet it is. And so the diet diversity is pretty huge if it's at 3 to 4, meaning they eat a lot of different plants. So in this particular case, the diet of the males and the females didn't differ. However, in Uganda, in Murchison Falls National Park, Michael Brown and Doug Bolger did a study where they split the area that the giraffes live in, the Rothschild's giraffe in Murchison Falls, into 2 areas. One was called the Delta and the other was farther away from the Delta. And what they found was that there were sex differences in the diet in the Delta area, excuse me, with males eating more acacia males were eating more Capparis species and females were eating more acacias. That was in the Delta region. But in the adjacent region next door, there were no sex differences. So are there sex differences in feeding among giraffe? Well, that depends. I mean, in one area they were, in one area they weren't. In our area they weren't. But in Uganda, in the same park, in next door neighbor places, there were sex differences in one and not in the other. So go figure. Now, what about age? Same picture of the little guy reading the male. As I mentioned, it takes them a while to grow up until they become adult sized. Females not until 5 or 6, males when older. And so if you compare the diet of 2-year-olds, juveniles or less than 2, to adults, there is a significant difference in what they're eating. And what's not a surprise is adults are way more likely to eat, this is the sausage tree, because it's hard for the juveniles to get to the sausage tree. Juveniles are more likely to be eating the sesbania than the adults, because it's a low-lying bush. Now, the adults can bend down and eat the bush, but they might as well reach up in the trees and eat the trees, or the leaves from the trees. So age does impact what they're feeding, probably because of how high they are. Sex may or may not influence what they're eating, and season does influence what they're eating. The summary take-home message is they have a really varied diet. So what about their morphology and their physiology? Well, you got to start with the neck, because everybody talks about the giraffe neck and how large it is. The neck has 7 cervical vertebrae. They're long, but there's only 7 cervical vertebrae. Everybody listening to this talk has 7 cervical vertebrae. Giraffes are more closely related to cetaceans, whales and dolphins, than they are to elephants. It's hard to figure out where the neck is on a whale. Whales have 7 cervical vertebrae. In fact, of all the mammals that have been studied, there's only a handful, manatees and sloths, that don't have 7 cervical vertebrae. So why do they have a long neck? Well, there's 3 reasons that people have suggested for why they might have a long neck. One of them is that it's called the browsing hypothesis. They evolved the long neck in order to feed on leaves that are high up that no other species can reach. And then there was a series of elegant experiments that Elisa Cameron and Johan Dutoit did in Kruger National Park, where they set up places where the smaller size species that feed from the same, well, the smaller size animal species that feed from the same plant species of the giraffe couldn't gain access to the food. And they found that the giraffe do tend to eat the food that the other species are eating. And so based on an ecological principle of comparative exclusion, so you can't have 2 species eating the same foods at the same time, they said the giraffe probably evolved a browsing hypothesis. So in order to avoid competition with the smaller ones, they could feed up at higher levels. In addition to what they wrote in their article, the other possibility is that they evolved it to occupy a niche that was unoccupied. There's no other animals in Africa that eat exactly what the giraffes are eating. The birds fly in and they can eat some of the flowers, and the baboons eat the flowers also from these same trees that they feed on. But giraffes really have a monopoly on the acacia. The second idea is that they may have evolved the long neck as a watchtower. I showed you the pictures of them being vigilant. They're really vigilant. They stand, they look around, and excuse me. So they may have evolved this long neck in order to look for predators. But the browsing hypothesis and the watchtower hypothesis are not independent, because while giraffe are browsing, they don't just keep their head in the lush vegetation all the time. They pop their head out, they look around. In the study that I mentioned that Elisa Cameron did earlier on the neck and the foraging behavior, they spend about 20% of their time being vigilant while feeding. They stop feeding, they look around, they look at their next door neighbors to see what they're doing, but they can also look around to see what's doing elsewhere. The third idea is based on the concept of sexual selection. Says, well, they evolved their long neck because they use them as battering rams when males are fighting. And one of the basic problems with that idea is, in general, sexual selection produces traits that are more variable than those that are not a result of sexual selection. And the variation in the neck weight, the mass of the neck, in males and females is not different. And it's about the same as their teeth. So at the moment, the consensus is more that the long neck evolved to allow them to browse on items unavailable to others. Along with the long neck, they evolved their long legs. Now, there's the shoulder blade. So this is the humerus, this is their elbow, and then this is their wrist. Now, they do have relatively long legs, which actually brings me to their scientific name, of all things, which is Giraffe camelopardalis. Now, the reason for bringing that up is the giraffe comes from an Arabic word, giraffe, meaning swift or fast. The camelopardalis is because the long neck is like the camel, and the pardalis is the leopard part. So it's a spotted animal with a long neck that runs fast. So how fast do they run? They run as fast as racehorses. When you watch giraffe running in Africa, you think they're just kind of loping along. They don't look that fast. But in 1973, the Triple Crown winner in the United States was a horse named Secretariat. And Secretariat was running about 60 kilometers an hour. Give you 2 minutes to try to figure out how fast giraffe run. Time's up. They run about 56 kilometers an hour. So put on your giraffe cap, thinking cap again like a giraffe. Hard to imagine, but if you were to go to a racetrack and have thoroughbred racehorses running against giraffe, it'd be a close contest in terms of who might win the race. To give you some idea of how tall giraffe actually are, just take a minute to look at the picture, because these are not bonsai elephants. They weren't bred to be tiny. They're not little miniature elephants running around. This one's got a bit of tusks growing out. These are full-size elephants. And so most elephants can actually walk under a giraffe. When you're in a tourist vehicle and you're at a distance and you're using your binoculars, sometimes it's not easy to gauge how tall they are. But another way to imagine how tall they are is they're about as tall, they're almost as tall as a 2-story building. The tallest giraffe in the world, if they lifted their head up, if they had the opportunity to pick their head up and they were trained, they'd be just high enough to knock the pole off of the pole vault that was at the height of the world's record. So when you see pole vaulters at the Olympics and they're running around and they use those poles to go over the horizontal bar, they're basically flying as high as a giraffe stands. They could look at them eye to eye. Now, one of the more interesting things about, they're fascinating things about giraffe morphology and physiology, tying together their long legs, long neck, and again, here's the elbow, here's the wrist, so they're not double jointed, is they have to have a heart which is strong enough to pump blood all the way up to their head. Really powerful heart, high blood pressure, pumps the blood up to their head, while at the same time pumps the blood down their legs without causing edema to develop. They don't want to have a bunch of fluid building up here because the blood's coming down and it's having a hard time fighting gravity because it has to get back to the heart. So they have a clever system for that, as well as when they bend down to drink, the same heart is pumping that blood high enough to go against gravity and get all the way to the head. But when it gets here and you watch giraffe drink, they're not spurting blood out of their eyes and their brains don't blast open from this huge blood pressure. So what's going on at the bottom and at the top to protect them from this high blood pressure, which is about twice what human blood pressure is? And the answer is, at the base of the skull, there is a system of interconnected veins and arteries called the rete mirabile, which is pronounced about a dozen different ways. So the rete mirabile, rete mirabile, rete mirable, whatever, you name it. My Latin sucks. But it's a network which, when the blood comes down this way, diffuses it in such a way that it won't go through the brain. You know, Francois Deacon has mentioned, or he's given a talk to this group, as Willem Dafoe, and they are looking in more detail using magnetic resonance imaging and other advanced techniques at the circulatory system. How is it the giraffes have developed, and what exactly is involved in the mechanisms at the top of that head to stop them from fainting when they stand up, as well as drinking without blasting blood through their heads. At the bottom, what happens is their skin is so tight, it essentially functions like compression socks. So if you go to the store, you buy compression socks, they're tight. And the reason they're tight is because they constrict the blood vessels so you don't get a bunch of buildup there. It's minimal, and then it goes back up. One of the unique things about the giraffids, and that's Giraffes, is they have what are called ossicones, as opposed to horns and antlers. Now, A horn is made of keratin, so it keeps growing throughout life. And people are famous or know the rhinoceros for having the horns, the rhino horns. And antlers shed every year. Both of them grow from the skull outward. Ossicones don't. So baby giraffe are born with a few little cartilage points here in the middle that eventually grow down, takes about 4 years until they fuse with the head, the parietal bones here. So the cute little giraffes have cartilage, it begins forming into bone, their ossicones have these little black tusks, then they develop and they become this really picturesque, nice, beautiful giraffe with wonderful ossicones, and her hair's combed nicely and her ears are even posed. Then in males, what happens is they continue bone growth. These are not ossicones, although sometimes people refer to them that way. These are bone growths in really old males. Their ossicones are kind of worn down from some of the fights they've had. They don't have much hair on the top, a lot different from when they were younger with these black tufts. And sometimes you'll see a male with only one ossicone. Chances are they lost the other in a fight. No one's sure why giraffe have ossicones, so that's another study some students can do. One idea is it's temperature regulation, and whether they regulate the temperature, whether they evolve for that purpose or not, they do regulate temperature the same way their ears are regulating temperature, in the same way the body's adjusted for thermoregulation. You can't avoid it. The other idea is that they're really useful for male-male competition for some reason. But the ossicones are surrounded by a network of nerves, blood vessels, skin, and hair. So it's just like every other part of the skin, which surrounds the body, which has the bones. There's a lot of attention being paid, or people like focusing on male-male competition. Hardly any males ever fight among giraffes. These are adolescent males. They usually spar. They do spar a lot. It's a little unclear why they spar, but adult males don't get involved in tough fights that much. It's a rarity to have two bulls fighting each other. Sometimes they do. There's one study by Ficus Fusion, only one, working with Francois Deacon, where we were able to document that the male fights occurred when the females were actually sexually receptive, which is what you'd expect. Humans have a hard time figuring out whether giraffes are sexually receptive or not. Whoop, timeout, got a message. So best way to figure it out with giraffes is to do a hormone analysis. So we did a hormone analysis, and what happens is if a female gives birth, calf dies, they start cycling right away. Males are interested in females only around the time they're receptive. So these peaks are when females are ovulating. They go through multiple cycles before they get pregnant. Calf dies, or calf's born and dies, excuse me, the other way around. Calf born starts suckling, and then the female can begin cycling about 100 days afterwards. Francois Deacon, again, based on his studies when we're able to immobilize the giraffes, we were able to find out, which people had thought for a while, that giraffes do conceive while pregnant. This is a calf mother. This is the calf, about 3-4 months old. This is a picture of her uterus at the time. It's a baby calf. She got pregnant while this one was still suckling. So put it all together and figure out what's the giraffe conservation status. I'll probably end the talk in like about 10 minutes, so hopefully you're patient. So Anne Innes-Dagg wrote the Bible of Giraffe with a colleague, published it in 1976, but the 1982 revision is the one that people rely on the most. Then she updated it in 2014. In the 1982 version, the word conservation doesn't appear. This is the sad part. In the 2014 version, not only has the title changed to include conservation, but there's a lot of references to conservation within it. So in the 30-year period from the first edition to the second edition, conservation has become an issue with giraffe. So what's the situation with the giraffe conservation status? So the IUCN has a bunch of different categories. The extinction risk from least concerned up to they are extinct. They're threatened with extinction if they're one of these three categories. How do you figure out which category it is? Well, what happens with the IUCN is they have this whole checklist. There's 5 major things and a bunch of minor things you go through. The Giraffenocopy Specialist Group created a red list assessment team of 17 people, evaluated all of this, spent a few years doing it, and then came to the conclusion that the giraffe were vulnerable to extinction. Again, in the categories, this is vulnerable to extinction, which means they are threatened to disappear if nothing is done. There are 4 major threats to giraffe. One is habitat loss, one is civil unrest, one is illegal hunting, and one is ecological changes. When the analysis was done, there was 1 species and 9 subspecies, and there are about 65,000 mature individuals. 2 are critically endangered, 2 endangered, 2 vulnerable, 1 not threatened, and 2 least concerned. The way the IUCN works is a combination of population size, geographic distribution, and population trends. So 4 of the 9 are decreasing, 4 were increasing, 1 was stable. Put it all together, and there's close to a 40% decline over the last 30 years, which is 3 generations. Redoing the graph to include both increase and decrease in size, which is something to consider, 5 are less than 1,500. 5 populations of giraffe are less than 1,500. 4, with almost 1/3 of the giraffes in Africa, are Maasai giraffes. Their population is going down. So you have a combination here of a decreasing population with a small sample size. And even the ones that are increasing, like the West African giraffes, there's less than 1,500 animals. There's only about 400 reproductive age animals. So where does that put giraffes in comparison with others? Well, elephants get a lot of attention, and there might be 1/3 elephants, maybe 400,000. But here's elephants. How many giraffes? There's less than 100,000 giraffes. Chimps get a lot of attention. There's probably 1/3 chimps. The ones that I studied, the thorn-across giraffe, they're down here. There's only about 600, which is less than the number of mountain gorillas. The 4 main threats are repeated here because all of them are actually due to one threat, which is human beings. So human beings are the biggest threat to animals, to biodiversity. It's not that lions are killing and eating half the calves that is the biggest threat. It's what humans are being. And by the way, lions, back to the other graph, I have to go backwards here. Lions are way down here. There's only 20 to 30,000 lions or something like that. So they're even more a problem. Go back to the human beings. So human beings are the biggest threat. And there's 2 main conservation controversies about what to do here. One is a point that Willem Dafoe in his talk mentioned, which has to do with simply population growth. And the second part is education. Actually, there's 2 parts that he talked about that are duplicated here. The highest fertility rate in the world is in Africa, these colors here. The highest fertility rate among countries is in Niger. In Niger, an average of 7 kids are born to a person. So the solution or the question is, why is it controversial to raise the issue of population growth? And briefly, I can tell you from personal experience, the reason is because, having been confronted by this issue before, there are people in Africa who have said to me, an attempt to control fertility in Africa is nothing more than a white supremacist, racist goal of dictating to Africans how they should live their life. And so stop with your intrusions on our lifestyle. We'll have as many kids as we want. Now, mind you, I'm not saying everybody says that, but I have been asked that question as opposed to, why aren't you having fewer kids? Second controversial issue is to hunt or not to hunt. Because there is a school of thought that says hunting is beneficial to conservation because look at the situation in Namibia and South Africa, where there's legal hunting, and in the case of giraffe, the numbers have increased. So a couple of points about this one, because I won't dwell on it, it's a whole topic in itself, is nobody that I know of in the conservation community is actually saying legal hunting is a problem. Of the 4 threats, it's illegal hunting. One of the things which gets glossed over is that the argument made against hunting, part of it, is that hunting provides an avenue for the illegal hunting because there are shipments of parts taken from giraffes that were illegally killed with the trophies that go out from the legally killed ones. And the idea that hunting itself is responsible for the population increases is contradicted by the other slides that I showed you, where there's no hunting in Uganda, but the Rothschild giraffe numbers are increasing. There's no hunting in Niger, but the numbers are increasing. Which also brings me, and I'm almost done with the talk, to a paradox and an issue that people oftentimes don't realize with conservation is there isn't a black and white system here. It isn't save or not save. It isn't economy or ecology. It can be pretty difficult to figure out. So take a simple thing like whether or not population increases influence giraffe trends. Niger has one of the highest increases in giraffe population size. Niger also has one of the highest increases in the human population growth, both occurring side by side. So to close, just want to bring to the attention, especially to students, that around the turn of the last century, there was a hunter who became a conservationist who thought there were so many giraffes, even though they're disappearing, they'll be around forever. But it turns out that's not the case. In the US, in the early 1800s, there were somewhere between 3 and 5 billion passenger pigeons. And about 100 years later, they all disappeared. In a 40-day period, they recorded 12 million. And I repeat that 12 million of these birds were killed in a 40-day period. So whether or not there are a large number or a small number, they can still go extinct. So now, to bring it all together, in case you fell asleep, here's the bullet points of the point of the talk for conservation. And my final message is that we do have a difficult prospect and a recipe for disaster among giraffes in the context of conservation because of their life history, which we can't do anything about. They have a slow growth rate. They have an extensive interbirth interval. They only give birth to singletons. They have a high calf mortality rate. The average female giraffe may only produce 2 or 3 calves or 1 or 2 females. In general, that means giraffes, if left alone in their natural habitat, are close to 0 population growth. Thank you.
I see we already have 2 hands up at the moment. If you would like a question, please use the reaction tools at the bottom, or you could write a comment or a question in the chat, or you could just wave. We will see you eventually. Roland, please go ahead and ask your question. Please unmute.
Good evening, Fred, and good evening, everyone. Thanks very much, Fred, for a very interesting presentation. I'm in Angola, and I'm actually very interested in where you're getting your data from. because to my knowledge, there's no, and I've been here 20 years, to my knowledge, there's nobody really working on the Angolan giraffe. And the reserve, Mopa National Park, was created to protect the Angolan giraffe. But during the war, it became a refugee camp. And it's hardly a park anymore. And there are no giraffes there. The only area that I've encountered them are in the Luwenge-Luwana-Mavinga National Park. Not so much Mavinga, but mainly Luwenge-Luwana, which is on the Namibia, and it's in the southeast on the border with Zambia. So I'm not sure where you're getting your data from, because in my experience, just apart from those small pockets, they are pretty well extinct in Angola. So that's the first point. The second point goes to the issue of population increases and decreases in areas where they are hunted or where they're not hunted. I think to a large degree, my understanding is that hunting tends not to play so much of an important, I'm talking about legal hunting, not illegal hunting, play not so much of a role, other than that when in South Africa and Namibia, which I've worked in extensively, the money generated by hunting generally allows for better management, and therefore it's about habitat, suitable habitat for giraffe, whether it's in a hunted or unhunted area. I'm talking about professional hunted. Those are the criteria that I think are more important with the population increases. And the final thing is more as an observation that we've picked up that recently, over the last 4 or 5 years, that traditional medicine, local medicine, for some reason, giraffe are now included for their body parts, especially their skulls, to be able to produce traditional medicines. So that's just, I brought it up with some friends of mine in traffic, just to flag them as a possible target for traditional herbal medicine. So, yeah.
Okay, so there are 3 issues here, and I'll go through them briefly. The first one concerns Angolan giraffes, and the short version is despite their name, they were driven to extinction during the Civil War. There were no giraffes there. But the subspecies itself lives in the west part of Namibia. So they're called Angolan giraffes, even though they live in Namibia. So the answer to your question is essentially the Angolan giraffes live in Namibia. There are talks of moving them back because they used to be in Angola, which is where they got their name.
Okay,
but
can I just pick up on that?
When I use the term Angolan giraffes, it's from the ones in Namibia.
No,
the answer to your second question regarding hunting, money, and management is the most well-documented instances in South Africa, the country of South Africa, for a population increase in giraffes come from Kruger National Park, where hunting is not permitted. The money issue has been thrown up and back from both sides in terms of what brings in the most amount of income. What's lacking is information on the distribution of the money, for the most part, because it's in private hands. So it is, I don't want to dwell on the topic. I brought it up simply to raise awareness that it is a controversial topic in terms of human wildlife and conservation. The last one, as far as the local medicine goes, is unsolvable, in the sense that what has happened is rumors fly around about what's useful for particular diseases. I don't know if it's still prevalent now, but a few years ago when I was in Zambia, word was making the rounds that eating giraffe brains is a cure against HIV. I have no idea how it started, no idea what's up. I'm sure 100 years ago they weren't eating giraffe brains as a cure for HIV. They didn't even know about HIV. So how these things pop up, I don't know. I know I used to live in Oregon, In Oregon, they would poach black bears to get the bile to send to China to use for medicinal reasons. So I think it's great you brought it to the attention of traffic. And I suspect that these things just change over time. But I don't think that a lot of the indigenous people were killing giraffes for medicine.
Okay, Frank, can I just pick up? I work in Southeast Angola, and I've personally seen lots of giraffe in Luwengi-Luwana. So I know that the population is predominantly in Namibia, where I've also worked, but they're definitely not extinct in Angola. The area where they occurred, the reserve Mopa National Park, was actually set aside specifically for that subspecies of giraffe. And that, during the war, turned into a refugee camp, and it's barely it's hardly a tree left. But in terms of the southeast, on the Namibian border, Luwengi-Luwana, there's certainly a lot of giraffe, which I see on a daily basis, not a daily basis, weekly basis.
The consensus were that they had gone extinct in Angola. So the reports of them being there were missing from the literature.
Thanks, Fred, for the answer.
Johan, you're doing this.
Judith, please go ahead and unmute and ask your question. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. I love this talk. I thank you so much. I've studied zoology and I've studied mammals for 40 years, and it's the first time I've learned that giraffe horns are called ossicones. Thank you so much for teaching me that. But I'm fascinated by these giraffe horns. What on earth do they exist for? Are they an adaptation for thermoregulation? Are they a touch sensitive? You showed us lovely pictures of giraffes rubbing up against each other. Do they rub up with the horns? Or is it just that all artiodactyls have these bony protuberances on the frontal bones? What are they there for? What are they about?
So the short answer is the last one's not true, because among reindeer and caribou, those are the only deer where the females have the horns. So in a lot of species, the females lack the antlers, well, the males have them. So it's not that it just comes about. The answer to the first part is why they have them is nobody's clear. Some folks have suggested thermoregulation, and what I was saying was whether or not they evolved for thermoregulation. They function as thermoregulatory devices in the same way that ears are thermoregulatory devices, but they probably didn't evolve that way. I mean, think about your own ears. If you go out in freezing cold weather, they get cold. That's because the circulation is condensed. You're not sending a lot of blood there because you're going to lose a lot of heat. Big ears is useful. Big ears are useful as a heat dissipation mechanism. Elephants have gigantic ears, and they do help thermoregulate because of the big ears. But that doesn't mean elephants evolved big ears for thermoregulation. So giraffe have ossicones that thermoregulate. We don't know. We do know that they have a lot of nerves and an intricate blood supply within the skin that goes around the ossicones. We know that nerves function for feeling. They could be using those during the social interactions. They may be using them as sort of early warning devices if the biting ants come from the trees onto their ossicones. But the real issue is nobody knows. There really hasn't been any solid studies of ossicones, a little bit of studies of their development. They are used in male battles, but they're facing an opposite direction to what all other animals have in terms of these armaments on their heads to be useful for fights. And then the question which always follows when this is brought up is, if they're used for fights, why do females have them? They don't spar, they don't fight. And so I would suggest to the students It's another opportunity for a solid project is to delve more into the functional and adaptive significance of ossicones, which okapi have, but they're just tiny little nubbins. Okay, hope I answered your question.
Great, thanks a lot. There's a related question in the chat that's asking, is that the same material as rhino horns?
The answer is no. Rhino horns are made of keratin, which is a hard, compact protein in your nails, or it can be looser because keratin is also what makes up your hair. So rhino horns are essentially a gigantic hair growing out of the rhino nose. The ossicones at the center are bones. So they're more like antlers, because antlers have bones as the base, but then the antler part grows out every year in the males, and then it's shed, and the next year it comes out bigger. So they're neither antlers nor horns, but inside the ossicon, as the slide of the giraffe male skull showed, they are bones which protrude from near the back of the head. So they're not the same as rhino horns at all.
Fantastic. Andy, please unmute and ask your question.
Cheers, thanks, Fred. That was brilliant. One thing I was wondering, you've done a lot on the giraffes themselves. What about their role in the wider ecosystem? If we do lose giraffes, what's the impact going to be? Do they do seed dispersal, all that sort of stuff? Be interested to know, please.
Okay, so the short answer to your question is yes, they do. They definitely do seed dispersal. They also do pollen dispersal because the pollen attaches to these ossicones. I mean, for all I know, they evolved as seed dispersal mechanisms. Back to Judith's question, it's another possibility that they evolved as part of the ecosystem. And so the answer is yes, they have an impact because they are spreading plants. They don't knock them over like elephants do, but they do spread plants. The other impact that they have on the ecosystem is I didn't comment on it, but I showed you a slide where this giraffe was stretching its neck out and feeding from a tree. Underneath it was an impala. So one of the impacts of the system is when they are feeding in the sloppy feeders, the flowers can come down when they're when they're feeding in the top of the trees, and the other wildlife eat from them. So they help feed other animals. They help spread the seeds of these trees. And so they do have a role in the actual ecosystem. As a minor point, just to follow up on what you were saying, is one of the biggest changes that have happened in the conservation community in the last couple of decades is the real recognition that focusing on a species is probably not the best way to do it. If you want to save giraffes, then saying we want to save this one species, or whether it's elephants or rhinos or lions or what have you, is probably not the most productive approach. So the conservation community has shifted gears to ecosystems, because the ecosystems themselves are an evolved interaction of both plant and animal organisms that have taken millions of years to develop, and they live within a system which is also being modified by humans. And so saving any species, and I guarantee you Craig's going to talk a lot more knowledge about this next week, involves working with local communities and ecosystems that include these wonderful creatures like giraffes. In fact, as an aside, and then I'll shut up, worms are one of the most underrated animals that have an impact on the ecosystem. Just simple earthworms.
Thank you, Fred. Andy, please go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, hi, Fred. I wondered if you could do me a favor, please. Would you broach the one species or 4 species or 9 subspecies topic and make clear what the truth is, please?
Yeah. Well, first, a disclaimer is that Andy and I were both members of the International Union Conservation for Nature Giraffe and Okapi Specialist Group, who were part of the Red List team, which stated that there was 1 species and 9 subspecies until such time as a complete review decides otherwise. So that's the disclaimer. The answer to the question, try to be as blunt as I can, is there's no answer, because species and subspecies don't exist in nature. Species and subspecies are categories devised by people to figure out similarities and differences among animals. And so, depending upon the definition of species, depending upon the data that's used, depending upon the analysis that people undertake, one can construct a taxonomy of giraffe that has 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 species. And I'm not being sarcastic here. Depending upon your definition of species, depending upon the data you use, depending on your interpretation of the data, any of those can be internally consistent. So the Giraffe Phenocopy Specialist Group said, at the moment, there's some debate as to how many species there are. It's a controversial issue. So the consensus was, as you well know, but the audience may not, we decided to go with 1 species and 9 subspecies, and form an advisory group to figure out, okay, is there a better way to classify giraffe? Now, the advisory group was supposed to be set up a while ago and pull together all the information to figure out how many species there are. And the agreement among giraffe specialists was, let's stick with 1 species until we have another assessment. What has happened, and I think this might be why the questions come up in your mind, is there has been a specific group of individuals associated with a specific organization who have taken it upon themselves to push 4 species at the expense of the other alternatives. So this has created some confusion in the conservation literature, as well as in the public literature, because some of the names of the giraffes have now changed. And in their attempt to push the 4 species approach, they've effectively sidelined the Giraffe Phenocopy Specialist Group as any kind of authority on taxonomy, because the agreement among the giraffe specialists was, let's stick with it until a new consensus emerges using all the evidence. Now, as an example, the 4 species approach uses a genetic definition. They ignore everything else. The morphology, the distribution, the ecology. And so internally, it's consistent with the way they've examined it. But their own data, the exact same data, has been interpreted by other scientists as 3, 4, or 5 species, depending upon where you draw your line, because, again, species and subspecies don't exist. It's a continuum. So where do you draw the line? As an example, consider human age. When does somebody become an adult? It's arbitrary. Driver's license is one age, consensual sex is another age, being in the military is another age, voting is another age, all of which define adult depending upon what you're looking at. So the short answer to your question is there are many species as you want there to be between 1 and 9. Nobody has yet said there's 10 or 12, so don't say that there's 12 species. That'll just complicate everything. Between 1 and 9. I do think, in my professional opinion, there is enough evidence from multiple fields to say that there's more than 1 species. I'm not going to say how many I think, but I think that there probably is more than 1. But I also think that the Giraffe Phenocopy Specialist Group should form a taxonomic advisory committee like they were going to do a few years ago. And perhaps now that the chair has changed in the Giraffe Phenocopy Specialist Group, there can be movement forward. Although that's difficult because a number of people on the group have already used the 4 species in publications, which is also very unprofessional when you come to an agreement that there's one species and 9 subspecies. So let's go with that until there's a consensus. And then you toss that in a trash bin and say, well, my own data says 4 species, so that's what I'm going to use. It's not very professional. So I will withhold my judgment on the number of species other than to say there are probably multiple species. 1 subspecies, 9 subspecies is the consensus. It's the one I use now, despite the fact that I'm not convinced that's the best taxonomy. So you can pick and choose whichever you want, Andy. Oh, and so can everybody else in the room, by the way, not just Andy. But it was just, as I mentioned, me and Andy were the part of the team which said, look, there's a lot of differences of opinion here, so let's just go with the consensus. Consensus, by the way, does not mean unanimous. It means consensus. Okay.
Fred, thank you for that answer. That was comprehensive. I would just like to mention, while we still have a sizable group in the room, you would have received with your email to register for this event a link to a movie about the life of Anne Innes Dag. I would like to really, really recommend that you see the movie if you haven't done so yet. It's truly inspirational. If you are not aware of it, she was a pioneer scientist as a woman, and her work is still authoritative and really respected among scientists at the moment. So we have a truly great spirit in the room tonight, and thank you for joining.
Could I just say one thing, Johan, about Anne, which is even more remarkable, is that she's sometimes referred to as the Jane Goodall of the giraffe world, but she actually preceded Jane, who should be called the Anne Innes Dag of the chimpanzee world. But more than that, what is missing from what a lot of people know about Anne herself is she is a very modest person and very forthright. So in the 1982 book, she compiled all the information she could. There are hundreds of references on giraffe and summarize what giraffe were like. The 2014 book does the same, but in effect, it also points out the erroneous conclusions of the 1982 book because of new information which has come up, which have changed viewpoints. So one of the things which Anne noted, for example, is in the 1982 book, one of the things she discusses are the loose associations between giraffes, like with mothers and calves. Because when she was in South Africa studying the giraffes, and based on the literature at the time, there didn't seem to be a tight bond between them. 30 years later, we know that there is. The grandmothers will even have bonds, if they live that long, with the young giraffe. And so although some scientists are reluctant to say, shoot, I had it all wrong, Anne is one of the more remarkable academic people who will stand in front of a public audience and will say, don't read my earlier book because it's full of misinformation. There's new data, new interpretations. So I'm not writing the second book to make money, but it actually is a more accurate description of what's going on with giraffes than the first book. And she has actually given talks to that effect.
Well done. Amazing. Marette, could you please unmute everybody and we can give Anne a round of applause.
Thanks so much.
Wonderful.
See.
Right. Judith, thank you for waiting. Apologies, Judith, please go ahead and ask your question. Thanks for waiting.
Thank you. My question, I want to say I really agree with you about taxonomy and naming too many species. And I know exactly who you're talking about. My question is, looking at the giraffe skulls and the male skulls in particular, there seem to be this huge nasal expansion. Does this mean that the males are using a lot of olfaction for recognizing mates? And if these species have different olfactory signals, then they would be cryptic species, right? We wouldn't be able to tell one from another. Do you think that's part of the taxonomic problem? What I want to know is, I know that taxonomists draw the line all over the place, but giraffes don't. Giraffes draw a very specific line.
So again, the answer is nobody's done a lot of solid research on it. The expansion could be to increase the sinuses, the area for the sinuses within the skull, which is multifunctional, one of which is also, it provides a mechanism for thermoregulation. So we're back to thermoregulation. If some of these giraffes that have these developments live in hot areas and there's dry climates, it might pay for them to have larger areas where their sinuses are than those that are living in more damp climates.
Okay.
If giraffe are like most other animals, and there has not been a single study that I know of, again, students pay attention, the chemical composition of giraffe urine in terms of scent communication has never been examined. But if it's like other animals, it probably differs not only by reproductive state, but by individual. So now we're back to, if the smells differ by individual, as well as the coat patterns differ by individual, to what extent does that influence giraffe reproduction, which then might influence whether they are species or subspecies?
Yeah.
So we don't know the answer to that. In terms of taxonomy, the question comes up, should or shouldn't you use the skull morphology as a criteria? Now, I'm asking that as a rhetorical question only because there are scientists who do adopt what they call the genetic definition of a species, and that simply, for the most part, looks at neutral genetic material. They are not they are not defining species as organisms adapted to their environment. And so in that case, the sinuses and the skulls would be irrelevant to a taxonomic category because they're not a neutral gene. So I would say your question is fascinating. There isn't a lot known about olfactory communication in giraffe. There's also not a lot known about acoustic communication. There's a guy, Antoine Baotic, and he has studied some giraffe communication as well as elephants, examining the possibility, because there's suggestive evidence they may use infrasound to communicate over long distances. And so he's trying to delve more into that to figure out, do they, and if so, when? And if not, then how do they communicate over long distances? So because we are visual animals to a large extent, and giraffes seem to be visual animals to a large extent, their other senses have been ignored in the scientific literature, so not a lot's known about scent communication or auditory communication in giraffes. As an aside, in terms of taxonomy, since that was your original question, in some species, like some galagos, they have defined species based on the acoustic calls. We don't know if that's the case in giraffe or not, because we don't know anything about what they're doing acoustically, other than sneezing and snorting sometimes.
Okay, thank you, Fred. Fred, a question related to the subspecies question, perhaps. I read somewhere that there are two distinct giraffe body patterns. Is it true, and do they cohabit together?
Two distinct what?
Two distinct body patterns.
Okay, that's a great question. It's not two distinct patterns. There's a consensus, again, it's a consensus of 9 distinct coat patterns. Now, back to the idea of variation. It's a widespread species. There's variation and not strict limits on how they are differentiated by their coat patterns. But there have been 2 attempts that I know of, well, 3 attempts to quantify coat patterns, one of which was not involved in the species question. That was by Derek Lee and Monica Bond. And they found that there was some heritability to certain aspects of the spots. So giraffe calves resembled their mothers more than they did other individuals. So there is a genetic basis for some of the spot patterns. Now, the other 2 that I know of, one is by Russ Seymour, and he attempted probably the first quantitative analysis of the spot patterns of the giraffes. And he found that you could distinguish them with a high degree of reliability using principal components analysis and his particular measurements. So again, you can't put them into specific bins. There's a little bit of overlap, but there was a high degree of predictability in which of the bins the giraffes would belong to based upon his quantitative analysis of the spot patterns of these different populations of giraffe. There was another study done by a student in London, and her name escapes me at the moment. And she was focused on comparing the thorn-crossed giraffe with the Maasai giraffe. And she used a different quantitative approach than Russ did. And she also found, with a high degree of reliability, that you can distinguish the thorn-crossed giraffe spot patterns from the Maasai giraffe spot patterns. Now, as I mentioned, the thorn-crossed giraffe were the ones that I studied the most. And the curious scientific aspect to that is because these same group of people in the same organization that is pushing the 4 species published a poster in 2015 saying, can you spot the difference, that had 9 coat patterns. In 2017, they published a poster saying, can you spot the difference, that only had 7 distinguishable patterns. So somehow between 2015 and 2017, 2 of the patterns disappeared as being distinguishable. And the woman in London who did her master's thesis on that, her advisor happened to be the guy putting out the poster, who ignored her findings in order to conclude this. The group that is pushing for the 4 species, based on genetics, did an analysis of the thorn-crossed giraffe's genetics. And their first conclusion was that they are very, very closely related to Maasai giraffe, but different enough they should be considered a separate subspecies. So the Maasai are Giraffe camelopardalis tipolcherski, and the thorn-crossed Giraffe camelopardalis thornicrofti. Then a few years later, they published a paper saying, on further analysis with more data, there's no really distinctive reason to keep them separate, so there are no subspecies of Maasai giraffe. The Maasai giraffe run from southern Kenya all the way through to the South Luangwa National Park. Those are all one species. Most recently, they published a paper saying, actually, with more data and a new analysis, there are 2 subspecies of Maasai giraffe. Giraffe tipolcherski and Giraffe tipolcherski thornicrofti. So science does advance, science does change. I would not accuse these people of flip-flopping like politicians to test the wind and figure out how you can get the most amount of money to get reelected. That's not their goal. But regardless of their goal, it does indicate how, to some extent, taxonomy can become convoluted when the same people come to a conclusion that thorn-crossed giraffe is a subspecies of Maasai giraffe. But thorn-crossed giraffe is actually not a subspecies of Maasai giraffe, they're the same thing. But oh yeah, actually we were right the first time. They're a subspecies of thorn-crossed giraffe. Now, in context, there's another study saying they're a completely different species. So you have this confusion in taxonomy, which is, are they a species? Are they a subspecies? And if they're a subspecies, then which species name do they get? Which is a long way of answering the question itself, which is the extent to which the 9 populations of giraffe are distinguishable based upon their coat patterns is another one that I would suggest students, hello students, can do as a project. You know, find pictures of all these different species, figure out another way to quantitative. Scientists love quantitative things, so you can't look at it and say, yeah, I think I see the difference. However, for the audience, I'd say if you want to see a real difference, the most distinctive differences among giraffe, look at the skin patterns of a reticulated giraffe. Then look at the skin patterns of a Maasai giraffe. Look at how the spots. The reticulated giraffe are clearly different than the Maasai giraffe. Both species live in Kenya. They're isolated, but they do live in Kenya, along with Rothschild's giraffe. Kenya is the only country with 3 of these kinds of giraffes. But it can give you some clue as to how the patterns do differ in these different groups of giraffe. And the question is, okay, if you have this continuity, where do you draw the line? Do you need to be able to say, with 50% correct, 80% correct, 40% correct? Where do you draw your criteria saying, okay, I can visually say these are Maasai giraffe and these are Nubian giraffe, or these are Angolan giraffe, these are South African giraffe. They look very similar, those 2 types.
Thanks, Fred. Marty, I saw you went looking for the giraffe. Please ask your question.
Cool. Thanks, Fred. There were moments in the talk that were very high grade, so you stretched our brains a bit there. But yeah, I wanted to just ask a couple of questions. Just in terms of, you mentioned where lions are present, the death rate in the young, or a lot of the young are taken by lions. And you'd also had the other graph where you'd said that basically I think it was about 50% don't make it past 1 year old. So does that differ in populations where there are lions present to where there aren't lions present? Is that a mortality rate quite different according to the areas where lions are present and where they're not? I don't know if that's possible to talk a bit about that. And then you'd also said something about the net overall growth rate is 0% of giraffe populations. And what is actually the ultimate thing that's attributing to that? Is it habitat loss or just the way they breed? So yeah, to try and kind of understand a bit more there. And then just something that hasn't really been discussed much this evening, there's been lots of talk about spots and all sorts of things, but the giraffe tongue. I mean, it's the most fascinating part of their body. The way that they can literally stick it right into the middle of a thorn tree and grab hold of a branch and thorns. I mean, if I think of putting my tongue inside that, it would just be blood everywhere. And how have their tongues actually adapted? Because I mean, I'm pretty sure it's still a tongue. It's still tongue material, but what's happened to it to be able to make it be able to do that without being punctured and bleeding and all of that? I'm just quite interested. And then while we're talking different subspecies and what are their tongues pretty much all the same through the species? I know there's color variations from almost black, purple, pink, red. So yeah, maybe if you want to just talk about tongues of giraffe. Thanks.
Okay, so in order, no, 3 good questions, and I love seeing the giraffe behind you. It's cute. So the issue of lion predation on giraffes, in terms of, well, your first question, does it differ where they're present or absent? So where they're absent, they can't prey on the giraffe.
Yeah, sure.
So the question is, what's the mortality rate in those areas compared to non? And the best answer I can give you is we did compare mortality rates from the animals kept at the San Diego Zoo Safaripark with those in the wild. And if you look at zoos in general, they don't like talking about, calf mortality, but the death rate, because there's no predation and it is a zoo, is about 10 to 20%. The 50% is an overall, so you can have some years where 80% survive. You can have some years where 80% are killed. I'm making up the 80%, but basically there's a huge variance. So it's an average approximation over time of about half, which is also how I would answer your second question in terms of the net population growth. The figures that I presented to you was for an average giraffe. There probably isn't an average giraffe though. So based upon the life history characteristics of giraffe, you would expect them to be at zero population growth. But that doesn't take account the rest of the ecosystem. So some populations are increasing, some are decreasing, and the issue is we can't do anything. The issue for conservation is we can't do anything to speed up their rate of increase because they're constrained by their reproductive physiology, their biology, and essentially the reproductive rate. We can't speed that up. If you were to eliminate all lions, you'd improve the survival rate, but then you get rid of all the lions, so that's not a good solution. So to maximize the ability for giraffes to survive and to reproduce can only come about if they have enough resources to turn food into offspring, which means places to live, which brings them into conflict with people and population growth.
Which kind of went to the habitat destruction sort of side of the question, but of all of the animals where there is wildlife human conflict, I would say that giraffe are probably the least of a problem compared to elephants and other cats, etc. Yeah, so is it possible that their numbers could increase in areas where they currently aren't found? Because I guess it goes around where there are trees that they can feed on.
Right. So essentially, the answer to your question is it's an indirect impact because they aren't trampling down any sort of domestic crops and eating them like elephants do, and they aren't sneaking into places in order to kill people like lions might do.
Yeah.
So it's not a direct threat from people killing them. They are illegal killing them in places, and that is a major threat to them. But in terms of the landscape part, the bigger threat is, and this is especially true in the areas in Northern Africa, Somalia, Ethiopia, Sudan, Kenya, where the droughts had a major impact on civil unrest and human movements. So there's a limited number of places that humans can go to if they want to herd their cows and find some food. And inevitably, they come into conflict with the giraffe because they're using the land that the giraffe are using. So the effect of the impact of humans on wildlife in the context of human-wildlife conflict with giraffe is less an issue of the giraffe causing damage to human property or human lives than it is of humans causing damage to giraffe property and giraffe lives. Then shifting over to your third question about the tongue, no, I didn't talk about the tongue. So studies have not been done about the tongue, which is quite large. They can actually, for the rest of the audience, one reason why the tongue is fascinating is it's huge. Giraffes can actually use their tongue to clean out their own ears if they want to, or to clean out their nares if they want to. They're massive tongues. They are very muscular. They're very rigged. And so they are strong enough that what happens is when they feed, they strip the leaves off the bark or strip down leaves. And so they have evolved a protection in the sense that the outlying area to the skin doesn't actually get cut when they're stripping leaves off of the bark. And they can go for a few leaves, one leaf. They don't grab the branches of the trees with a bunch of thorns on them and then try to strip that off. There is variation in color, but nobody's done, again, students can do this, a systematic study of color variation within populations, let alone between populations. They do have dark colored tongues on the top. They tend to be anywhere from blackish to bluish. And what some people might find promoted in some of the literature is that dark color is a really good adaptation to protect them against sunburn. But giraffes don't walk around Africa with their tongues hanging out of their mouth and need a protection against sunburn. So the reason's unlikely. And their closest relatives, the okapi, also have a dark colored tongue, and they live in dense forest regions, and they're not sticking their tongue up into the sky to try to avoid sunburn. So why they have the dark colored tongue is still unknown, but it's probably not to avoid sunburn. And the extent to which tongue color itself may differ either among animals within a population or between populations hasn't really been examined in detail, hasn't been examined at all as far as I know.
I mean, the color almost tells you that there's a rich amount of blood there. They're very sort of, and again, needing to be so tough, you wouldn't think that there would be blood so close to the surface. But yeah, I was just intrigued by the tongue. So thanks for the answers.
Well, as an aside, forgetting the tongue, the skin itself, and it's the same with human skin, has different thicknesses. And it turns out some of the thick parts of the giraffe skin actually are in the hind area where they might get scratched by thorns, but they might also get attacked by lions. So skin thickness itself changes throughout the body. Your eyelids have a lot, well, so do mine, so it's not just you, people. Eyelids are a lot thinner than the palms of our hand when it comes to the amount of skin we have, or the soles of our feet. So I don't know the extent to which the tongue is thick and protected and muscular, the anatomy of the tongue, but some student can pursue that, the color and the anatomy of the tongues of giraffe. That'd be a good project.
Cool.
So thanks for the question.
Thanks.
Just quickly unmute. Thanks, Marty. Thanks for answering that one, Fred, or those questions. Question from Desiree in the chat. Since there are many sensitive vessels around the ossicones, do you not perhaps think there could be a possible link to sensing vibrations from threats or other herds, and not only needing to rely on hearing and sight, especially while foraging among high leaves? Just a thought.
I wouldn't think so, but I'm not sure. I don't see the activity around giraffes when they're surrounded by leaves is causing a lot of vibrations in the trees that would be a danger to the giraffes as far as a sensory mechanism goes. So I wouldn't say no unless somebody first, does a study and tries to figure it out in detail. But my gut level tells me they probably are not very good sensory devices for patterns like that. They could be good sensory devices towards movement. So if their head's in a tree and a bunch of monkeys come into the same tree, they're likely to the tree's likely to move. And they would feel that movement, and they might feel it before they can see them. But I'm not sure that that would be detrimental to giraffe.
Yeah, that makes sense. On my screen, Julia is right next to you. So she asked a question in the chat. But Julia, would you mind to unmute and ask the question live, since you're right next to Fred? Julia, are you still there? There we go.
Yeah, I am here. How are you guys?
All right, thanks.
Yeah, no, I was just asking if isn't genetics the best way to distinguish taxonomy? If they are, and I mean, those guys who make mistakes, did they just report on one paper, or was it just multiple?
Yeah, the connection's not good. The question is spotty. I can't follow the question.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you, but yeah.
Hello?
Do you mind to repeat, Julia? Sorry, you broke up a bit there.
Is it? Oh, yes, my connection is unstable on my side. Sorry.
Okay.
So I was those guys who did a study, and they found out that there were two different subspecies, and then they went back and said, no, they aren't. Was it based on just one single paper, or was it multiple papers over maybe quite a few years? How does it work? How do you decide on the subspecies based on how many papers must you then or studies must you done to actually really define the subspecies?
Okay, so that's a great question. In this specific case, what happened was they used more genetic information. So the same group used genetic information to come to the first conclusion. They added a bit more to come to the second, and they added even more to come to the third. So in their case, it wasn't a question of doing a literature search and refining things. It was they kept adding more information, and that's how they kept changing their mind, was a result of the added information with their new analyses.
Okay. I see.
So just to reiterate the key point that I was making was within the same research group over a short period of time, depending upon the data collection and the data analysis and the data interpretation, you can go from a subspecies to a species to a subspecies in less than a half a dozen years.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Understood.
Julia, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. And again, but genetics, isn't it more reliable than using morphology?
Okay, so that's a fantastic question, which gets asked all the time. And my short answer is morphology is due to genetics. The issue is not genetics itself. The key issue in taxonomy is that those who adopt the genetic definition of a species are excluding any sort of information related to how giraffes have adapted and adopted to their ecosystem. Because the genetics that are looked at, whether it's genome sequencing or mitochondrial DNA or sections of nuclear DNA, are not those that are regulatory and functional. They're neutral. The second point to keep in mind is there is absolutely nothing about the animal that is not genetic. Genes are involved in creating the morphology. Now there is an interaction with the environment, but morphology, spot patterns, behavior are also influenced by genes. So the genetic definition is a bit of a misnomer because morphology also depends upon genetics. And I would say you probably get my leanings by now. is I don't know of any other scientific field where you intentionally ignore relevant information at the expense of coming up with a solid finding. Most scientists accumulate more and more information, try to put it together in a broader perspective. A genetic definition of species that relies upon neutral genes does not do that. Just imagine, so instead of putting on your giraffe thinking cap, put yourself in Charles Darwin's position. Now, he didn't know about genes,
Yeah.
but how did he come up with the idea of natural selection? He put together information from morphology. He put together information from embryology. He put together information from paleontology. He put together information from psychology. He put together information from geographic distributions. He didn't say, I'm going to figure out how species evolved by ignoring all of this information and only looking at factor X. And this is one of the biggest and most fundamental problems in today's world, is a lot of taxonomists do depend and rely and consider genetics to be the key thing. So I give a whole nother talk on this, but essentially that approach is a non-Darwinian approach, which if you want to take it is fine, because you are not looking at the organism as adapted to the environment. You're looking more at the genes that have nothing whatsoever to do with the environment, and therefore they can give you some idea about population genetics, because they can give you a window into genetic drift, for example. How long or how isolated have populations been? But whether they can tell you taxonomy or not, again, is completely up to whether you think you can only use those traits.
Okay, so it's better to use all of them combined.
Well, better is a relative term. I think so. I think what you would want to do, I mean, to me, so I'll start from the end point. Giraffes,
Yeah.
and the question came up earlier about influence on the ecosystem. Giraffes evolved as part and parcel of an ecosystem. They are reactors and they are actors. That's how they evolved. That's their biology. Taxonomy is a human way to split up animals into similarities and differences. Those similarities and those differences emerged as a consequence of animals fitting into an ecosystem in terms of what Charles Darwin called the economy of nature. It's an interrelationship of all these organisms. If you want your taxonomy to accurately represent a pedigree of giraffes, or the relationships among giraffes from a biological perspective, then you would want to include all of the possible information that you can.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you.
So I'll just, you don't have access to it probably, but I'll just give you a classic example. It happens to be Russ Seymour's PhD. So he has chapters there devoted to the morphology, to the skeletal measurements, to cranial dimensions, to spots, to genetics. He put together everything he could to come up with a PhD on the taxonomy of giraffes. And that's a solid scientific approach. Now, taxonomy is also flexible because more information might change things, more information might not. But I think it was Judith, one of the issues that came up earlier was with the geneticists tending to want to divide animals into separate species. What gets kind of disappointing in the way biology is approached now in conservation has been termed taxonomic inflation, because taxonomy was a biological field devoted to classifying animals according to similarities and differences independent of conservation implications. What's happened now is it's been co-opted into figuring out the conservation implications of calling animals different species. If you have a group of animals living in 3 populations, and they're 30 each, so you've got 90 animals in 3 populations, and you say they're all one species, that's 90 animals of one species. If you now do your genetic analysis and say, well, those 3 populations are distinctive enough that they're 3 species, you now have 3 populations of 30 that are really much more endangered than 1 population of 90, so it serves a conservation purpose. Now, I'm all for conservation, so don't get me wrong here, but when conservationists use taxonomy as a mechanism to promote saving species, they can actually undermine the field of conservation, because at some point, the stakeholders and the policymakers and the politicians are going to say, give me a break here. Every individual is different. So are we supposed to save every individual? If you look at their genes, every individual has a unique set of genes. So where do you draw the line? Are you guys just trying to be political here and have us save all these animals? Give me a break. So I am not only disturbed by the push to only use genetics because it doesn't follow Darwinian reasoning, and because it doesn't take advantage of all the available information that's possible, but because it can be totally counterproductive and backfire on conservation, even though it's supposed to be rallied in the cause of conservation.
I see your point of view. Thank you very much, Fred.
Yeah, thanks for your question.
Thanks, Julia. Thank you, Fred. At this stage, Ruan, I don't see any further questions. I don't see any hands up. Do I miss anybody, Ruan?
No, you did not miss anyone, not that I can see. I think all the questions were answered. Yep.
Yeah, I think everybody, they're probably all bored and tired by now. I mean, by you guys, it's late at night. It's time to go out and have a beer, chill out.
Maybe let's give Enrico Gernardi one last question, and then we'll say goodnight.
Thank you very much, Professor. It was a very interesting talk. I just had a question that I heard different opinion about giraffes when they're born, that they need the fall in order to start up their heart. However, I've been always thinking, if they need to start up the heart, how do they survive the whole time inside the body of the mom? So how does that basically what's really happening at birth with giraffes?
Okay, so yeah, it's a good question. For starters, their heart starts beating when they're in utero, like all mammals. What happens with giraffe at birth is the mothers give birth standing up, so the kid falls probably like 1.5 meters to the ground, plops down on the ground. As far as we know, they don't get a headache from falling on the ground. They've evolved that system. The biggest change at birth among giraffe calves is the same as that which occurs among all mammals, including human beings. And it's really an amazing development, because in utero, you're not breathing any air. You're living in a liquid environment attached to your mother through the umbilical cord, whether you're a giraffe or a human being. Now, at the moment of birth, you're all of a sudden exposed to the air. And at that moment, if your system can't change from an umbilical cord and a liquid environment to an air environment and breathing, you die. So there is an instantaneous change at birth, which I can't explain in terms of how the on switch is turned on, but it does have to happen immediately. And so it's not a question of the heart starting to beat in giraffe. The real question is the lungs starting to breathe at birth, not only in giraffe, but in people and in mammals. In whales and cetaceans, when the calves are born, they are born into a liquid environment. So it is similar to the mother's womb, but they're pushed to the surface because they still have to breathe air. They're mammals. So they're born into this liquid environment, but they can't open the blowhole right away in the liquid environment or they can drown. So somehow they're born and there's a pause until they get to the surface to open up the blowhole and take a breath of air. So I think that's a great final question, because the mystery of birth and how mammals ended up with this system going from a comfortable, warm, liquid environment to a shocking surrounding of air. And you have to use an organism like the lung, pre-designed to take in all this mushy stuff in the air, but take out the oxygen that you need for your system, is really an intriguing biological development.
Indeed. Thank you, Fred. Thank you for that answer. That's a lot to ponder in itself. Ruan, I think that's it for this evening.
Yeah. Yes, I agree, Yuan. It was absolutely lovely, and thank you for all the questions, and for Fred for sticking around. Absolutely brilliant talk, and thank you, Yuan, for taking all the questions, and for everyone for asking questions. So I think another round of applause is at hand. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for the invitation. Thanks to the audience for sticking around, for those who stuck around. And I certainly do hope that people have a much better understanding of giraffe and are clearly focused on conservation efforts here, and realize the predicament that not only giraffe, but that biodiversity face because of human beings. And so do your best to do whatever you can to help save the planet, because we have no other place to live. Thank you.
Thanks, Fred. Thanks, everyone. I think this was our longest one, Ruan.
Yes.
Sorry about that. I talked too much.
No, not at all. There's still 32 people in. Normally we terminate on 25, and we didn't drop to 25 at all. So thank you very much, Fred, and everybody. And I wish you a lovely day, Fred, and a good night to all the others. Thank you.
Okay, and thank you. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you, Yuan and Ruan and Maret. Appreciate it. Good night.
Thank you, Chris.
Appreciate it all. Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.